Hi, this is Devin Preer, and this is my presentation on insider trading. So there are two definitions to insider trading. The first and primary of which is the classical definition of insider trading. And what the classical definition of insider trading states is when an insider trades in his own corporation's stock while in possession of non-public information. That's given by the SEC. Now what this means is that essentially those who commit insider trading under the definition of the Classical Act essentially gain an unfair advantage over more morally obligated people doing the trading. In essence, they're giving themselves an unfair advantage that most people don't have. And then insider trading, of course, is regulated by the SEC, and it's regulated under the Security Exchange Act of 1933. Going into more issues on the classical theory, there are certain gray areas within the classical theory of insider trading that can prevent heavy punishment to offenders. These can include the offender disclosing the intent to trade. So if there's a certain workaround within the classical theory that if they either have in their contract that they can trade securities as part of like a retirement obligation, they then could commit certain acts that could be defined as insider trading, and they can do it perfectly legitimately and legally. And there's also certain things in the classical theory that make it hard to punish non-corporate offenders, so people outside or that wouldn't be considered technical insiders under the classical theory of insider trading, even though they're still committing insider trading, they're just not within the company. So, and that can arise of things such as corporate espionage, or, say, for example, a company loses important documents, and that gets on a hold of people on the outside. They use that to gain that unfair advantage that's key to insider trading at its core, but due to the classical theory, it's just hard to punish people using that definition in these circumstances. To combat the shortcomings of the classical theory of insider trading, they developed a secondary theory known as the misappropriation theory of insider trading. It changes the criminal nature from a fiduciary breach of trust to an ethical breach of trust of both the employer and the customers. This negates many of the loopholes that are present in the classical theory of insider trading. It eliminates the certain contractual safeties that can be levied upon people, as I just touched on before, whether or not they have certain retirement loopholes that are written into certain corporate contracts regarding how they sell off stocks as part of like stock retirement plans. And of course it eliminates that outsider protection clause. The way this misappropriation theory does this is because it turns it into a ethical breach of trust to the customers of the company by stealing that company's information and gaining that unfair advantage over certain morally right traders. They would be harming the customers of that corporation, so therefore it'd be an ethical breach of trust of those customers. And then moving on, we're getting into the actual main legislative part of that, of insider trading and how it's regulated, the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933. The primary clauses dealing with the insider trading, I'm not going to go through all of that. It's basically Regulation 10B, as well as 10B-5-1, which serves to clarify some of those loopholes that 10B leaves in, because a lot of 10B is based off of the classical theory of insider trading and its definitions. So within 10B, a lot of those loopholes can still be found. And what 10B-5-1 and 10B-5-2 seek to clarify is they just add in more of that misappropriation theory line of thinking into the legislative parts of the SEC Act of 1933 to kind of tie up some of those loopholes. Obviously, those extra clauses weren't added within 1933. I believe 5A was added in about 1953, and then 5.2 again was added in about 1964. Now we get into the punishments of insider trading. Maximum prison sentence of 50 years. However, the longest prison sentence actually levied was about 11 years. Maximum fine allowed for insider trading, $5 million for an individual. And then for non-human entities, so like corporations and whatnot, the largest fine that can be levied is $25 million. Now, it should be noted, too, that if a corporation's employee is found guilty of insider trading, even if their company was not aware of what that employee was transpiring, what they were doing, the company can still be fined unknowingly. Now, another key thing to note about these is a lot of times in regards to sentencing and punitive punishments, the maximum is almost never given out. As I said, the maximum prison sentence ever levied to one individual for insider trading was only 11 years. It would almost have to be a crime hugely unheard of for the person to receive the maximum sentence of 50 years. Most individuals pay anywhere between $40,000 to $250,000 as far as monetary damages go. And then the actual mean for the time an insider does in prison is about 18.3 months, so a little over a year and a half. And like I said too, the average amount paid for restitution is about $450,000. Going into famous cases now. We lead with the SEC versus Texas Gulf Sulphur Co. Now what this was Texas Gulf Sulphur. They purchased a strip of mining land in an unspecified location in the mid-1950s. Now what this was this mining strip was very rich in copper, and upon finding this discovery of land, they knew they'd make a ton of money off of it. So what they did is a lot of upper management from Texas Gulf Sulphur Co. encouraged a lot of their middle managers and employees to buy up large amounts of shares in stock at a low price, and then once they disclosed that information of their recent purchase to the public, their shares shot up, and then at that time the employees sold all their shares to make a profit. The SEC caught wind of this. They didn't really like the ethics behind that transaction and why it took place, so they stepped in and ended up suing Texas Gulf Sulphur Co. Texas Gulf Sulphur Co. was eventually fined, and they had to pay an amount of monetary restitution. I believe it was around $40,000 in the mid-1950s, so it was still a pretty good chunk of money in comparison to that time, accounting for inflation and things like that. But what this case was really important for was it set the precedent that the SEC was willing to punish and regulate these things for larger companies, because at the time Texas Gulf Sulphur Co. was one of the largest companies in its industry at the time. Next we have the United States versus Boesky. Wall Street figurehead Ivan Boesky was brought up on charges of insider trading in the mid-1980s. He was accused of making over $30 million based on sales due to information he acquired due to insider trading. The gentleman he acquired his information from was influential Wall Street figurehead Martin Siegel. He actually purchased his information from Mr. Siegel for about $700,000 in 1985. He made a huge amount of money off of this. It was almost unprecedented, the amount of money he was making due to insider trading. One of the firms he worked with, he brought about $50 million to them, so you can obviously see where a good majority of that money was coming from, was transactions that were made with knowledge that most people they didn't have the ability to foresee or predict like he did. He was actually prosecuted in the mid-1980s. It was funny because for the U.S.'s legal prosecution team, the leading prosecutor was now, I guess, the mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani. And he really wanted to drill home because this case brought about a lot of negative sentiment towards Wall Street, and it actually served as the inspiration for the film Wall Street, starring Michael Douglas, too. But at the end of his trial and all the sentencing and stuff, he was only charged with 3 years in prison and only forced to pay $250,000 in monetary damages. You look at how much he made, about $30 million. Even his fine was not even a quarter of what he was paying the guy for the information to begin with, so he still made away with what is essentially amounts to a slap on the wrist as far as punishments go. Next we have Schiarella v. the United States. Vincent Schiarella was accused by the SEC of insider trading in the mid-1970s. He was a markup man at a financial printing company, and what he essentially did was the company would print out, the company he worked for, would print out sheets of transactions, so buying and selling of securities of companies that would go on several months in advance. However, one key thing to note is that it wouldn't actually list the names of the companies, but based on the nature of the transactions, Chiarella figured out which companies would be buying and which ones would be selling. And so using that, he was able to determine what companies he would need to buy securities and stocks from, which ones he needed to sell off in order to make the maximum amount of profit he could. This was all guesswork. He based it off of theories and things and such. But as it stands, he did make a pretty good amount of money of this. He made about, let's see, $30,000 within the span of 3 months. So SEC caught wind of this, took him to court. A couple years later, because I believe the original, the case started in 1975, but in 1977, Chiarella rebutted the charges levied on some of insider trading by the SEC. He argued that because he was not affiliated with any of the companies he was doing transaction with as an insider of that company specifically, and that they have not given him any of that information pertaining to when their prices would be high or low directly, that he was technically not an insider of the company and could not be considered an inside trader. He used this kind of exploited some of the faults in the classical theory of insider trading, and he was able to use that to his advantage, and due to this, the court ruled in his favor, and he got the case dismissed, and he made off relatively easy. But this actually was the case that inspired the Supreme Court to adopt a lot of, well, not the Supreme Court, but the federal government to adopt a lot of the misappropriation theory into the SEC legislation. Now for some improvements. I believe that we should have stricter legislation that eliminates loopholes within the Security and Exchange Act of 1933. In my paper, I go through a lot of examples and a lot of different viewpoints that view the SEC Act of 1933 as a relatively weak legislative document that really has too many loopholes to be excusable for a document that could be applied to laws today. Developing a more business-oriented watchdog system, giving businesses incentives and maybe tax breaks and subsidies to incentivize them looking out for insider trading and things of that, rather than having the government do all of the policing. And I think having the business remedy the problem would do a lot more goodwill to reaffirming faith in the general public. And then lastly, but most importantly, developing a more complete unified theory of insider trading theory, doing away with a lot of the classical theory of insider trading and developing and growing upon the misappropriation theory, and having that be more comprehensive and all-encompassing as in regards to the situations that it covers. Anyway, like I said again, I am Devin, and that is my presentation on insider trading. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.